tell us about this, another aspect, I think, of white privilege. And then after that, I want to get a little bit into, like, just the word racism and get into that a little bit.
Okay.
But again, there's things that I'm worried about with my children, but I'm understanding that it's very different within the black community. So talk about that. Talk about, one of my team members wrote me about, just the fear that being a black parent or whatever has. And I read the text to my wife, and we both literally just wept because this is not anything that we can comprehend.
Yeah.
And I almost cry thinking about it now.
Yeah.
I told you about this the other day and I cried.
Yeah,
It's just so, because it's someone I love and care about, and that they have to live with this fear that I've never even thought about for one time in my life.
Yeah.
So talk about that component of fear in relation to your kids and
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing, so I do think that there's this thing about whether or not your child would be, shot or something like that by a police officer or whatever. But to be quite honest, that's not the most immediate fear, largely because of my John is 15 now, and so he just has gotten to the point where he's looking like a man. You know, John's my height now, his voice is deep and all that kind of stuff. So that's actually a newer fear. I wasn't really worried about my son being gunned down at age 6 or 7, simply because he's a little boy, so it's not a problem. And so this goes for Julia as well, who is about to be 13. The harder thing for them is worrying that your child is going to end up buying into whatever the stereotypes are about them, and that it's going to limit them in life. That's the biggest fear. It's that they're going to believe what they see portrayed on TV or what they hear people say about them or whatever, and that's going to keep them from becoming what God really wants them to be. And that's something I think about all the time. April and I talk about it regularly. There are two basic, I guess the most two damaging caricatures of black men and women that you're worried about your kids becoming. For my daughter, it's that people will just say she's just an angry black woman. There's this caricature of the angry black woman who always has an attitude, who does the neck roll thing, and you know what I'm saying?
Because and this is gonna admit, like, in the white community, we, if like someone does that, we make that comment that
exactly. And so, this thing, and it allows Julia to be dismissed and for her opinion to be marginalized and not matter at all, because I can characterize her as this angry black woman. So here's the danger of some of these caricatures. The issue is, the moment I put you into that box, what happens is I dehumanize you. And so you're no longer a human being made in the image of God who I have to worry about, whether or not your opinion matters. Now I can feel good about, or I feel nothing about, just dismissing you. I worry about that all the time for my daughter.
So in other words, if you worry about if she behaves in a certain way in the wrong context, that the next time she acts that way, people won't see her as having an opinion, but, well, she's black and that's how.
She's just this angry black girl, and
black woman.
That kind of thing.
So it's kind of like,
So same thing with John. I'm worried that he'll be labeled as, some athlete or a thug or whatever the label is, and then he won't be able to live up to anything else besides that, because that's the label he's always been given. My parents actually took us out of a school when we were in high school for that very reason, and we didn't know why. They took us out and put us in a different school altogether, and we begged to stay at that school because we loved it. And years later, I asked them about it. What was the reason? And they gave us a list of things that were happening that gave them the impression that we were seen as like the class clown or the athlete or whatever. And they felt as though we were starting to sort of buy into that and be limited by it. And the moment they put us in this other school, it's actually funny, when I think back over my academic life, I really began to thrive when I went to this other school that my parents put us into. And I hate to say this, but the school they took us out of was a white Adventist school. the school they put us in was a public school.
Yeah.
And so the impression I got from that and from other things is that we seem to be a lot worse with racism in the church than even outside the church. I find that in the world, I don't have the same concentration of problems that I sometimes have in the church. And I think that's inexcusable. That's what I was speaking to on Sabbath.
Yeah.
Because that's something I think I can have a part in as an Adventist pastor, is to try to help change that. And I do applaud you for doing the same thing last week, because I think that's part of our role as leaders in this church, is to try to help people to do better in the church. This is the one place where we shouldn't have the same problem the world is having. In fact, it shouldn't be worse.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, let's go to there then. I still want to come back to the word racism.
Yeah.
But let's go there real quick. Let's go to the church, though. Your dad's a pastor. Your uncle's a pastor. I know both of them. I used to work with your uncle, as you know.
Yes, I do.
And your uncle and your dad are very different. I'm friends with your dad and friends with Tim. I love them, but they're very different.
They are. Yeah.
Your cousin's very different.
True.
But how unpack that idea of racism in our church, and somewhat what you've seen, the excusing of it, whatever it may be, and then maybe let's even talk a little bit about state and regional conferences a little bit.
That's a good idea.
So.
Okay, so let's do this, because I did this in my sermon on Sabbath.
Okay.
I want to really simplify the idea of racism in a similar way that I tried to do with white privilege, because I think that word is sort of charged with so many different things.
Well, when people hear there's systematic racism, they go, or systemic racism, they go, well, that includes all of us then. So they're saying I'm a racist. People have a hard time with that.
Yeah.
I actually, in my sermon coming up this week, I'm referring to it as favoritism, because that's what the Bible says to it as.
Which is what I preached on last week.
If you don't like the word racist,
then say favorite.
Go favorite. It's fine. Like,
exactly.
Either way, it's a sin.
It is.
So.
And so that's the thing. And actually, when you look at the way James characterizes it, he sort of elevates it to make you know this is a really egregious sin. It's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
And so maybe we need to keep it with the word racism, because whatever the repulsive sort of recoil reaction that you have to that word, that's what you need to have every time. But I think the part is how easy it is for us to buy into racist views that we don't realize. I think we have to first start by realizing that the United States, our country, was sort of founded on racist ideas. The country itself became rich on the backs of African slaves, with the basic teaching being that they were inferior because they were part of a particular race. So really, racism is this to me, and Merriam-Webster is the way I got this from, but if I boil it down, it's the idea that you can be inferior or superior just because you belong to a particular race.
Yeah.
To me, that's racism. So anything that feeds that, I think automatically means there are people who don't think they can be racist that can be, because, or at least you buy into racist ideas.
Can I share another, like what I think is another aspect of racism in the church?
Yeah.
So because you brought up the Founding Fathers, and it reminded me of a book on Thomas Jefferson that I read, that I'm blanking on the title right now. Is by Ellis, whatever his name is. His last name is Ellis, but I don't remember what the title of the book is at the moment. But Thomas Jefferson, when he actually was writing the Declaration of Independence, a part that got edited out of the Declaration of Independence was he blamed King George for bringing slavery, but then not allowing them to get rid of it. The slave trade, to not allow them to. And the interesting idea, as you read about like this whole thing, is that he was unwilling. He saw it as a problem. He thought the ideal would be not to have it, but ultimately he didn't want to be the one to deal with it.
He didn't use his power to try to make it happen.
He didn't want to be the one to deal with it, right? So like, it's your fault that we
Right.
have it. Wait, also it's your fault that the blacks are the way they are,
Right.
because now that you guys have abolished slavery over there, they think they can uprise here, and yada yada. And never in the middle going, and that's a subtle form of racism that I think exists in our church now, is like, I didn't do this.
Right.
I didn't bring about the state conference or the regional conference.
Right.
I don't have to do anything. We're like Thomas Jefferson, you know,
Right.
like, so we're just going to allow this to remain. And that to me is still, as white people, if we do that, that's still a form of racism.
So that's the thing that I was going to say, right? So this is what I'm preaching about this upcoming Sabbath. I don't think it's enough for us to declare that we ourselves are not racist. We have to be able to say, I'm anti-racist. So saying that I wasn't part of the original problem, okay, that might be true because you weren't here 400 years ago or whatever. But to know that there's an issue and to not be doing anything to try to change it in any small way. By the way, you know, you may not feel like you have any power to really do anything, but what we need is for Christian people to become against racism. We're anti-racist. It's not enough to just say I'm not a racist. That's too neutral.
Yeah.
And the text that I'm coming from is really where Jesus, many times in the Bible, teaches us to be countercultural. It's not just about, you know, being in the culture and just not getting swept up by it. God wants us to actually learn these things in the culture so that we can combat them, because the gospel is countercultural. So that's what we really need in the church, I think, is more anti-racist. How many of us are against racism? And to be that, you have to do certain things.
I said in my sermons last week, it's not just that I don't hate blacks, I also have to love them at the level of Jesus' love, right? So that's what you're saying, kind of.
That's what I'm saying.
Way.
That's what I'm saying. Same exact thing. One is sort of a neutral position. The other one is an active position.
And we need to move.
We've got to be active. That's it. And I think we automatically think this is such a huge problem that there's nothing I can do. But there are things you can do. You can start by teaching your children to be anti-racist. So having conversations with your kids that say things like, you know what? That's what they do in the world, but we don't do that here. We don't treat people differently based on their skin color. Or if you hear a joke that is racist, you say, that's not funny.
You don't laugh.
I don't find that funny, I'm sorry. Not feeding into racist stereotypes, not just about black people, but you know, just this idea that, you know, we make jokes that, you know, Asian people are good at math. That's not always true. That's a statement that's based on a racial superiority based on the race. That we don't believe in that. We don't buy into that. So little things like that can make a difference. You and I, when we use graphics on the screen, if all of our graphics are always of one ethnicity, you know what I'm saying? Just little things like that. We're actually helping. We're trying. We're being anti-racist. We are crushing down this idea that one person is better than another for any reason, including race. That's what I think we need to be doing in the church. And it's one thing we're scared to do because I think it's the thing that has the least. What do you call it when you the risk reward? It has the least reward and the highest risk. Because the moment I start talking about race, I'm probably going to turn off at least half of the people that I'm talking to.
And I'm going to begin to be labeled as.
I'm going to be labeled as something. They'll say I'm of one political party or another, whatever. And then what's the reward? In the end, I end up getting arrows and spears, and you know what I'm saying? So most of us are like, emails. So most of us are like, you know, I'm not even going to go down that road because the risk reward factor is like, dude, the risk is so high, the reward is nothing. But see, we have to be motivated by really Jesus' motivation. He actually cared about the oppressed. He cared about those who were downtrodden. And he said, actually, I didn't come to save those who are already saved. I came to save the lost, you know? So this idea, we have to have Jesus' courage to stand up in many of these circumstances and speak out and do things, no matter how small, to be against racism, not just, I'm not a racist.
And in the church, that's, you talked about like little things we can do, just about like the videos we show, probably the stories we tell, even those little side conversations that we have.
You and I doing things like this, where we're deliberately being shown on camera together, a black and a white guy having a good conversation where we're obviously friends. That helps to feed the narrative that it's possible for us to see each other as equals and to get along. Those are things that are deliberately anti-racist. You know what I'm saying?
And I know, like with you, and you know, in my case too, we both have wanted to be intentional about integrating our teams.
We have.
You know, even though I'm in a predominantly Anglo church, you're in a predominantly black church, Is Anglo the right word? Predominantly
it's
white
fine.
church. I don't know.
Just say black and white.
White.
It's fine.
I don't know.
unless
I was trying to sound
unless
smart.
our viewers are
I
going
was
to be
trying
like
to sound
offended. Anglo is good.
I was trying to sound smart. I don't know.
But you're right. We're being deliberate about who we get on our teams.
Now, we're not hiring someone just because of
No.
the color of the skin,
No,
but we
we're
are
not.
saying, like, all things being equal,
Yes.
let's integrate, right?
Exactly right. Yeah.
So
And I think that's a deliberate move on our part to make sure that
just
we're
on that note,
anti-racist.
because you said it earlier, you're not looking for sympathy. Most black people are not wanting a job because they're black, right?
No.
I mean, there's this
Yeah.
that whole affirmative action thing that happened years ago has like perpetuated this in white people culture.
Yeah.
that it's not a meritocracy, but
Right.
that's not.
So let me tell you why affirmative action exists, and let me tell you why I know that it's just a human nature thing.
Mm-hmm.
So affirmative action exists because
You weren't even getting a opportunity at the table, right?
right. I think it exists because if the dominant culture, whoever they are, is not reminded about the minority culture, they would forget about them just as easily. I'll give you an example right now. The conference I was in before this one was a regional conference in, and by the way, I can segue after this into the regional conference discussion if you want to.
Well, it's a hot topic, but we should.
Yeah, that's okay. So the conference I was in before this was South Atlantic Conference, regional conference headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. And we had a strong Hispanic contingent in our congregation, in our conference. And my father-in-law was the conference president. This is April's dad. You are aware. My father-in-law would not, and by the way, I think he'd be okay with me sharing this story. My father-in-law would not consider himself racist or anything like that. One day, somebody asked him, how many churches do we have in Atlanta? And he answered very quickly. I don't remember what the number was, 15, whatever the number is, right? He said, as he was sitting there, after whatever the question was, the person was asking, they went on to the next thing. He sat there and thought to himself, wait a minute, we don't have 15 churches in Atlanta, we have 27. He said, I forgot all about the Hispanic churches. He didn't even count them. Now, they were part of his group of churches. So here's what that taught him. At that moment, he said, in this context, we are the dominant culture because this is a black conference. And in that instance, I forgot all about a whole group of people that are part of our conference.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's a human nature thing.
Yeah.
Given the opportunity, more than likely, we would forget about the minority group just because there's so many of us in the dominant culture. It's hard to remember that, and it's not always necessarily that you were doing that on purpose. But shame on us when we do that. As the leader of a conference, you can't do that. You got to remember your whole constituents. You know what I'm saying? It's so anyway. He repented for that. He felt bad about it, but then he started to understand how it could be that someone white might do something similar and not necessarily have a nefarious intent when they do that. Anyway, so that's why I think affirmative action is there. I think it's not perfect. It's actually probably very flawed, but in some ways, it might be one of the only times that a person would actually think to themselves, hey, you know what? I just interviewed a bunch of white people. Did I even consider interviewing a person of color for this position?
Yeah, it needs a reminder.
You know what I'm saying? Some way of reminding. Yeah. Anyway, so as far as the regional conference thing is concerned.
But hold on, before we go there, but what I was saying, though, is like just there's a stereotype that like blacks want this just so they can get a job not based on merit, but on right. That's not how that's not how we see it. So black people want to be able to have the ability to be considered in a situation, and because so many situations happen where we're not considered, we'll take whatever way of considering us we can get. All we want is an opportunity to show you, I might be the right person for this job too. Don't disqualify me just because I don't have the same skin color. In fact, there may be some aspects of my experience that would help you if you had me in your operation. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, that's definitely. It's like my oldest son on Sabbath says to me as we're watching your sermon, Daddy, he's really good at preaching. I took that to mean like he's better than me, but
There's no way he meant that.
I think it might have been my youngest son. My middle son likes Charles Tapp, and my oldest son likes you. And my wife likes the music and Emmanuel Brinklow. So I'm waiting for one of them to like me.
So like you. They like you. As a son of a pastor, do not worry. You're going to be their favorite pastor their whole lives.
But
and by the way,
yes.
you can really preach about it.
But I get what you're saying though. You in some even like white churches or predominantly white churches, you would never even get an opportunity to interview because
yes, that is true.
Even though you and I have some similarities in our,
our leadership style,
even some of our preaching
style. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
So
that's very true.
So it's
Well, anyway,
and it's because of color of skin.
In many instances, I think it is. Many instances, I think it's just not thinking outside the majority.
Yeah.
So it may not necessarily be
intentional
because of the right. It may not necessarily be because of the color of my skin, as in like I deliberately don't want to consider any black people. It might not be it. It may just be there's no real reason for me to go outside the majority culture. So why should I?
Yeah.
I'll just stay in this. It's comfortable.
So let's talk about now the thing that's been a challenge forever.
Yeah.
And that's our state and regional conferences. State being what are the white conferences that refer to as state. You actually taught me this. I don't know if you remember that.
I do. I remember.
Because I was like, I don't know what we call ourselves. Like,
yeah.
It was like my own thing. Like, we're conferences and you're regional conferences. And you're like, no, we call us.
Yeah,
we call you state conferences.
And just so that people know, part of the reason why the names were coined that way is because most white conferences encompass one state. There are a few that don't, like Carolina Conference is 2 states, and Georgia Cumberland might be 3 states. Whatever. But for the most part, those conferences are just one state, and then regional conferences for the most part. I don't think there are any. There are no regional conferences that are just one state. It will be like 4 or 5 states. Yeah. And so that's where those names came from. So
it's
really
those are the structural model at this point in our history.
It actually is
technology, which
to be honest with you, it's a great structural model. We probably could easily move to that.
We could talk about that another time. But so you were so I learned about the state. The other thing that I was educated on since I've been here in Maryland. Think about this. I've been a pastor for I don't know how long. I've been a pastor I don't know how long.
You didn't start in 2000?
No, because I worked at Southern for a year and then I came to seminary.
Okay.
Because they wanted to send me to a church, and I was, I've always been obstinate, and I said I'm not going there, so I'll take a call somewhere else. And they said, okay, well then we'll work here at Southern for a year, then we'll go to seminary.
All right.
So that was George Cumberland when we worked in Georgia.
That's right, exactly.
So, but it was when I was here that I learned that why regional conferences came into being. And kind of the mindset behind them, and maybe unpack that shortly for us if you can.
Yeah.
So that people can understand that a little bit too.
Yeah. So
because there's actually a mix, because I thought we as the white dominant did force those, but we didn't ask for them per se.
Right.
So actually the black community asked for them, but there's a reason behind that.
Yes. So okay. So you have to realize first of all that the United States that was in existence at the time when the conversations began, let's talk about late 40s, basically, when we're talking about this.
Yeah, well, you can go all the way back early 1900s when the first initial Charles King.
Yes, exactly. If you go back to there. But when you're talking about really organizing it and real serious conversations, we both read a book called Protest in Progress. It's a book by Calvin Rock that kind of gives some of the history behind how we got to where we are. First of all, it was from a mission perspective. The whole idea was that.
What's so interesting, John, is it touches my heart so much. Black people asked for it in part because they didn't want to be a stumbling block to white people. It was like they were thinking about white people who are racist.
At the time, there were so many issues where white people had a really difficult time with black people in their churches.
Yeah.
And black people wanted to see the gospel
grow
and to the black community. And so it said one better way of doing this is if we have what the United States was doing at the time was segregation.
Then we're not an obstacle to you, you're not an obstacle to us.
And then the church can grow. And it did, and it worked. And that's the way it happened. I think what has happened since then is that things have changed and evolved in our world. The rhetoric has changed. And now it feels as though having separate conferences, in a lot of ways, for people who are outsiders, when I say outsiders, I mean non-Adventists, a person that we might be trying to win to the truth, that's a big obstacle for them.
Mm-hmm.
They say to themselves, wow, you guys talk about having all these truths, and yet you have a segregated system.
Yeah.
How can you do that in 2020?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's been a lot of conversation about where we would go from here. And this is why I think conversations like what we're having right now are so important. Because if we're going to actually get to the point where we don't have separate conferences, we have to decide on a new structure. And that new structure has to be something that feels like to black people and brown people and people of other ethnicities. It has to feel like it includes them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And what I think a lot of people are scared of is going back to the way things were before, where they were excluded, and, and it felt like this isn't really our church. You don't really see it as ours. One of the things that bothers me a lot is when we talk about black history. And we talk about things that happen in the black community and black history or whatever. And I say to myself a lot, dude, that's American history.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's similar in this way. I want to feel like I, as a black person, am a part of the Adventist church. I'm not just a part of the black Adventist church. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I want to feel like the church is I want to feel like the church sees me as a legitimate part of it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so whatever this new structure looks like, I think it has to feel as though this is all of our church. It's not just the church for the majority.
When we were having those conversations,
which, by the way, the majority isn't even white in the world church.
Oh yeah,
but anyway, that's a different
conversation. Yeah, North America is like
right. Even North America.
Because we sometimes you're North America too, so I can say there's North American privilege because we walk around like it's like wait a second, we're one 20 something of the world church.
Exactly. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
But I was gonna say. Do you think we can get there? Because so I remember the conversations at seminary.
Mm-hmm.
Defoe, Dillis, all of us sitting around talking. And the biggest seemed to be obstacle was that I think I would say something like, well, let's just merge and we'll just merge into the regional conferences. And the response back was, well, then there's more of you, and eventually we're going to be voted out anyways. We're no longer going to have leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we get past that? Like, how do we get past where white people aren't just voting for white people? And how do we get past that fear that
Yeah. So I don't have the answer to that, obviously. That's probably, if that was more easily remedied, if that problem was more easy to solve, we would have already done it because,
it's about surrendering power, one side or the other, right?
I think so. So I think it's about surrendering power, but I also think it's about trust. I think that as long as white Adventists are not willing to have a conversation about the injustices of the past, mm-hmm. and about the circumstances that led us to a place where we felt like we had to have separate conferences, mm-hmm. because let's be honest, it wasn't like black people were like, we just hate white people. I mean,
no, I mean, you read
we
the
were
history.
The one being impressed.
I read that book, and I'm reading these quotes, and it's so sad because it's like we realize that we're getting in the way of the white work because you guys dislike us so much, and
yeah, that's what really started
we
it.
want the gospel to grow.
Yes.
And so if us being like even in the back rows is gonna negatively impact you, then don't. And like, I mean, even one of those opening statements of like, this hurts us more because we recognize that there's a high level of education within the white community, and we're no longer gonna have access to these things. I mean, it was really quite sad. Like, but we're doing this for the gospel. We're doing this for
Yeah, and that was back when it wasn't possible for a black person to have the same level of education.
Yeah.
Today it's different, obviously, but then it was a very different situation. And look how the Lord still blessed and grew the church, even in the midst of all of that turmoil. So here's what I'm saying. Black people have an inherent distrust that white people will do the right thing when given the chance. Because
that we won't do the right thing.
Right, that you won't, maybe, yes.
They don't trust that we will do the right thing when given a chance. Yeah,
exactly.
They have a distrust.
They have a distrust that you will do the right thing.
Yeah.
And
I
I'm
don't
not
know.
sure how I say
Yeah,
it.
we
You know what I
know
mean?
how
No. That's the problem. So here's how you build trust. You build trust by showing me first that you actually acknowledge that there is a very depressing and sad history that we have in this church that had black people and white people on different sides because the ones who had power were using that against the ones who didn't have power. There has to be some kind of acknowledgement of that and some willingness to talk about it and to apologize for it or whatever. I think
we can't even blame it on our roots because unlike America,
right.
It didn't come out of our roots because you read Joseph Bates, you read Ellen White, you read, John Byington, you read Uriah Smith, you read James White. They were extremely...
They were against slavery,
all
of that.
Anti-segregation,
Absolutely.
all these things.
Absolutely. But what it shows, which you see a bunch of times, is how deeply our American culture has impacted our Christian culture, and not the other way around. It would be better, obviously, if our Christian culture superseded our American culture, and where our American culture was wrong, that the Bible would help us to see that. But that hasn't been our history. Our history has been that we simply, we really
this is
find
not comfortable
ways.
in the world, so we're going to adjust.
That's it. We adjust in the church for what the world is doing, and that's not good.
Yeah.
So I'm saying it's going to take some leadership from the majority in this particular area to say, here's how we're going to surrender our power in order to benefit people who are in the minority.
Yeah.
And once that happens, then people will start trusting again and say, okay, well, maybe we can do this. But until then, people are going to say, I've heard this one before. You say all this stuff, and then what you do is, in the end, you switch it up, and then it ends up being just like it was before, and then we're marginalized, and then we don't have any. That's kind of the thing, and that's the tough part. It's like 400 years of undoing that you have to figure out how to do, and it doesn't go overnight. You know what I'm saying? It's like.
And that's what you just said there is a hard mindset for white people. Black people think more with a biblical mind, and what I mean by that, or a historical mind, is something that I think that we as white people haven't understood, or is black people reference slavery, and white people always are like, why are they referencing slavery? None of us were there. But if you read the Bible, people reference hundreds, thousands of years prior as a part of impacting what they're doing now.
That's right.
And so like even like you're referencing like the early church, and people would say, well, why can't we just fix it now? Who cares about? But they don't realize that culturally, tell me if I'm wrong in this, within the black culture, stories are repeated.
Yes.
And the story has more value than say within the white culture, to the extent of like, I don't go because this is what happened in 19 something.
Right.
I'm still, does that make sense?
It does. And I can't speak, I can't speak to the white side because I'm not white, so I don't know.
Yeah.
What I do know is you're right. In our culture, story is valuable, and history as well, and what our ancestors went through, but largely because of how it shaped us.
Yeah.
When you're trying to explain to your son why it is at age 4 that, the white boy did this and nothing happened to him, and the black boy did this and something happened to him, you have to tell him the history in order for him to understand why this is right now. Because he's 4. What does he know?
Yeah.
He doesn't even know there's a difference between him and this other kid.
Yeah.
So you end up having to tell this story to help them to understand why they can't just act any old kind of way. Because if you do that, you're going to get killed. So if you do that, you might get,
the present ills bring up the past history in the black home.
Correct.
And that
because they're all
shapes
connected.
Yeah.
There's no way around it.
Yeah.
If you don't tell your kid that story, he wakes up thinking he's white, and he ends up getting beat up or killed or whatever. The worst feeling in your mind as a parent is what comes to your mind in that situation. So you want to make sure that you help them to understand that. And also, you don't want them to forget about all of the ways in which his ancestors helped to get you to what you are now. That you say things were a lot worse than this, but do you know that such and such did this, and he did that, and she did that, and because of that, we have the right to vote.
And that's part of
you know what I'm saying? That's all part of the same story.
That's part of like what you were saying, though. Your parents tell you you're something.
That's right.
You're something because
That's right.
this person did something for you.
There were great black people way back then, and this is what they did. They rose up into this thing, and you're
And
like,
now
wow.
you're gonna be a great black person.
Right, and you don't see that. No, you read history, and there's no black people in it, except in February. so what's being reinforced in your mind is, well, the only great people were white.
Well, you see it
Black
all
people
over
don't do
Facebook,
anything.
like, why do we have a Black History Month? We have a White History Month.
And again, same kind of thing.
And then you'll see the black people post, we have 11 months
11 months of White History Month. And again, like I said before, to me, it's American history.
Yeah, all of it.
If there was a way that it was actually included in the history book, we wouldn't need a Black History Month, because we would know these are things that we teach, we don't shy away from, because this was part of it. But I do think there's a reason why I could understand why a white person would want to forget that part of our past, because there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It was evil.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't want to sit there and talk about that every time. I get it.
Yeah.
But it's almost like, we can't ignore it. It's actually a part of our past. And I think the more we face it, the more we can actually overcome it so that it isn't an issue anymore.